Hi, it's Rob from the Brush and Boltgun. Today I'm going to be doing a tutorial on how to paint a Soulblight Gravelords Vampire Lord. If you'd like to support us, our Coffee and Patreon page are linked below. Now onto the video. The first colour we're going to use is Citadel Khorne Red. I'm going to use this to do the bulk of the shield. I'm going to be using a different red on the dragon, which is given through the middle of the shield. But if you get any of the Khorne Red on, it doesn't matter too much. But you want to be doing the bulk of the shield in Khorne Red, leaving the trim of it so that we can do that golden a bit. Also, don't forget to do the rear side of the shield. There's quite a big open space that you can paint with the Khorne Red, like so. Next up, we're going to use Citadel Mephiston Red. We're going to use this to paint the dragon on the shield and also the vampire's hair. There's also a gemstone at the rear end of the mace as well, so if you want to paint that with the Mephiston Red too, you can do that now. I realised there was a gemstone a little bit further on in the video, so you won't see any action on that for quite some time. If you add the red to it now, that should do nicely. Now we're going to be using a little bit of Citadel Leadbelcher. I'm going to be using this on all of the mace except for the gem at the end. There's also some of the shoulder armour and knee armour, which is also done in Leadbelcher. Give that a nice smooth coat. Now, certain sections of this are a little bit dark just to begin with, because the miniature is actually all just black, so it has given it that kind of darker look to the videos. But not to worry, once we start reapplying the shades and the colours, that will lighten up quite a bit for you. So now we're using Citadel Retributor armour, and we're using that on the small batwing sections of armour which are coming out the sides of the knee. You've also got them on the elbows too, and we're going to be doing the trim of the shield with Retributor armour too. Now it's Citadel Mephiston Red. We're just going to do the inside of the mouth because we failed to do that earlier. Now we're going to be using some Citadel Pallid Witch Flesh. I'm going to use this to do the face. There's loads of detail on this face. My Pallid Witch Flesh is somewhat thickened and horrible, but it works okay. You can get away with it. Gives it a nice pale, slightly off skin colour for the vampire. Once we've added the shade and started to re-highlight, that'll look really, really creepy. Next up is Citadel Coelia Greenshade. I'm going to use this to do the skin. Gives it that slightly off green-blue shade to it that we can then build up from. The colour like this, it looks a little bit like the Vampire out of Salem's Lot kind of colour, that peculiar blue. We're going to reapply some colours to that, get it looking nice and fleshy. So now I'm going to use a little bit of Citadel Druchii Violet on the shield. We're using this to darken down the Khorne Red. Now if you watch the Blood Knight video of how I did the horse armour, we're doing the same thing on the shield here. I'll link up the Blood Knight video also, but you can give it a coat of Druchii Violet. You can give it a further coat if you want to darken it down a little bit more. Now we're moving on to Citadel Carroburg Crimson. I'm going to use this to wash the hair and also the dragon on the front of the shield. I'm doing the hair a little bit darker than the Games Workshop miniature here. I feel that was a little bit too bright. for me anyway. Obviously if you like it that bright colour, then you probably want to be doing the hair starting with a darker orange colour or something like that, but I'm doing it so it's a little bit of a darker red because that'll fit with the look of the army that I'm after. Now I'm going to be using some Citadel Nuln Oil. I'm going to be using this so that we can shade the Leadbelcher areas. So the knee armour, the mace and the shoulder armour. Give them a decent coat of Nuln Oil. You want it to be dark in those recesses and also in the concave sections of the bat wing shapes. Like so. Final shade is going to be Citadel Agrax Earthshade. I'm going to use this to paint all of the gold sections on the armour. Now we're just going to use a little bit more Agrax Earthshade, and this time we're going to be using it on the Leadbelcher sections that we've just used the Nuln Oil on. If you look at the images of the Vampire Lord, it looks slightly weathered and worn, so we're just using some brown shade to colour that a little bit. I'll just give it that grimy, aged look, like so. Now we're starting back on the skin. I'm going to start with Pallid Witch Flesh to begin. I'm using a Army Painter Wargamer character brush here because the face is very small, it's got a lot of detail on. I'm just leaving the shade in the recesses and trying to pick out all of those details, get the sections of the face so they're all based. Now you do want to leave the shade in the recesses. You also want to think about creases on the brow as well. There are some very faintly there. So just be very careful when you're applying the Pallid Witch Flesh to make sure that you leave the details in there. So the first layer done, we're now going to add some Vallejo White to the Pallid Witch Flesh, which thankfully thins it down a little bit because mine's getting a little bit on the thick and flaky side. And just take your time highlighting the sections that you've just put the Pallid Witch Flesh on. Now you do want to make sure that you leave it slightly darker, sort of under the cheekbones, and if you can see any of the neck, I've just left that dark too. In the areas where it would be shaded, just leave the shade in those recesses. Now I'm going to use some Vallejo White and mix that with the previous mix and just give the skin one final highlight. I'm just picking out the tops of the cheeks and the ridge of the nose, the tops of the creases on the brow, that kind of thing. Like so. I'm going to use a little spot of Vallejo White. I'm going to use this to do the whites of the eyes. So dragging the brush from near the nose to the outside of the face. Prevent you getting any of that white paint on the nose. Just very, very carefully pick out those eyes. I'm also going to use this white to do the teeth while I'm here, the two main fangs. Now we are going to use a little bit of Citadel Carroburg Crimson. I'm just going to use this on the eyes. Now what I'm doing here is I'm putting a little blob on the eye that will completely cover it, and just using the tip of the brush to draw off some of that paint so that you have the red around the edge and the white of the eye in the middle, like so. If you want to carefully paint it around the edge of the eye, you can do that too, but I thought this was a pretty easy and simple way of doing it. Now we're going to return to the Khorne Red. Like we did the armour on the Blood Knights, we're just going to pick out the ridges and do a slightly wide repainted the colour there. It's almost like you're doing quite a wide highlight along the ridge. Because we're not really going to be adding too much colour to this. We do want to keep it very straightforward and just have that highlighted area there. Also going to work a little bit of this colour down the edges too. So now we're going to move on to Citadel Wazdakka Red, and we're going to do a thinner highlight down the centre of the areas that we've just put the Khorne Red back on. So you're trying to get this highlight straight down the middle of the ridges. Also going to use it to do a few little highlights on the edge of the wings too. We did the Khorne Red, and also around the edges where the gold is too, you can see the Khorne Red. We're just going to highlight some of those areas too. You'll see them better on the next section. Now we're just going to add a little bit of white to the Wazdakka Red. I'm going to do one final highlight on these areas, just picking them out really as thin as you can get them. Little highlights, you don't want them all the way along, mainly towards the end of those wing sections. And a few little highlighted bits dotted around the edges too. Slightly off camera on that one, sorry about that. You can see where the highlights are on this section too. Now I'm going to start working with the Mephiston Red. So this is going to be for the dragon on the shield and also the hair. I was mainly going to show the dragon here, so you can see what's kind of going on with the dragon. We're going to be highlighting this as though the light's catching it from the top. I've done this because it works quite well in contrast with the shield, which doesn't really follow the usual lighting rules that I do. And then for the hair, we're going to be picking out all of the individual strands and highlighting them as though the light's coming down from the top. So with that layer done, we're now going to use Evil Sunz Scarlet. I'm going to start picking out the details and the edges and the raised areas on the dragon and also on the hair too. You want to be highlighting the areas of the hair where you just put the Mephiston Red, making the top edges that little bit brighter than everywhere else. It's also good if you do the highlights on top of the sort of bumps on the ridges of hair too, as that makes it look like it's raised up and catching a little bit more light. And the final highlight we're going to be doing on these sections is a little bit of Citadel Wild Rider Red. You can use this to do some edge highlights on the dragon and also some highlights on the hair as well. So with this you want to be covering about 50% of the areas on the hair that you covered with the Evil Sunz Scarlet. You're just generally highlighting this as though it's catching the light from above, so the top edges of the dragon are going to be lighter than the undersides of it. Now I'm going to use a tiny little bit of Evil Sunz Scarlet mixed with a little bit of Vallejo White. I'm going to just start adding highlights to the little gem on the back of the handle. So like the hair and the dragon on the shield, you are going to be using Carroburg Crimson to shade this earlier on. Then we're going to reapply the Mephiston Red, followed by the Evil Sunz Scarlet. Now with this highlight, we're just going to use a tiny little bit of Vallejo White, or whichever white that you tend to use. We're going to pick out some edges and corners on this gemstone. Now the sections are really small here. As such, I don't really pay it too much attention because it's a really small gemstone. You don't have to go quite as overboard as you would do with maybe a more obvious lens or a gemstone on a weapon or a shield or something like that. So by just picking out some of the edges and adding some of those little highlights to it. Then if you want to darken any areas, you can use a little bit of Citadel Druchii Violet, which is what we're going to work on now. So the way I've done the highlights and the lighting on it, I've just basically done opposing triangles on each section, lightening them to one particular corner, whichever one you want to choose to really. And then once you've done that, I'm going through the Druchii violets here and just darkening up the opposite corner to the one that you have highlighted. Now I'm going to start working on the gold. We're going to use Citadel Retributor Armour. I'm mainly going to be working on the edges and the ridges of the batwing style to the armour. There does seem to be a lot of my hand on this video, and it's just because of the way the armour is and the way the angles that I like to paint at. I am having to rotate the miniature quite a bit to get those things, because it is quite a dynamic miniature. You do have sections all over the place and facing all different directions, so it is being rotated a lot. Now we're going to be using Citadel Liberator Gold to highlight the Retributor armour. So using this to kind of do the ridges and the ends of sections of armour, highlighting a few little different areas where it'd be catching the light more, so at the ends of these sections and across the top. Now adding some Vallejo Chrome to the Liberator Gold, I'm going to start highlighting the edges of the gold sections on the armour, apparently off screen. So you can see highlighting the edges on the sections of the shield and any bits which will be catching the light more. Now with the Model Air Chrome mixed in with the Liberator Gold, it does really give a good highlight to gold. It's a lot lighter and it catches the light a lot too, so it does give that extra little bit of shine. Now going back to the Leadbelcher, and we're mainly going to be doing edge highlights like we did with the Khorne Red and we've done with the gold. I'm going up the front of the armour pieces on those ridges and around the top edges to make them stand out. Now they do look a little bit harsh and a bit too clear cut, so what I'm doing is I'm going to be coming back with a little bit of Nuln Oil, I'll show you this in a moment, and tidying them up. Now I'm going to use a tiny little bit of Citadel Ironbreaker. I'm just going to add a little bit more of a highlight to the areas we've just reapplied the Leadbelcher to. You can see certain areas where it does look like quite a stark contrast between the shaded area and the Ironbreaker that we're applying at the moment. Also not forgetting to do the mace as well. You want to have the blades and some of those edges highlighted to make it stand out. And finally we're going to use a little bit of Vallejo Model Air Chrome. I'm going to highlight the sections that we just put the Ironbreaker on. Now it's ideal on this for doing the edges of weapons because it is so shiny and it will make those edges stand out and look like they are sharp. If it's a bladed weapon, it's especially handy. This mace appears to have almost like batwing blades going down each side. It's ideal for them too. And then if you've got highlights that are too much of a sharp contrast between the shaded area and the highlights, just use a tiny little bit of Nuln Oil. We're just going to tone them down a little bit by moving some of the Nuln Oil over the edges of the sharp contrast sections, and this will tone them down and make them less obvious as a kind of distinctive line. I'm going to use a little bit of Vallejo Black. We're using this to reapply the black to the armour, so any areas where you might have overspilled and put a little bit of another shade or another colour onto the black armour, we're now coating that with the black just to make that disappear and go to its proper colour. This will just give us a nice smooth and solid colour to work on when we're doing the creepy green highlights on the edges of the armour. Now we're going to start working on the bats here. We're going to mix a little bit of Citadel Balor brown with some black paint. We're just using this to paint the leathery kind of sections on the bat's wings. So most of these parts are like little triangles between the long fingers in the wing. That's just to give them a little bit of colour and a little bit of detail. Now I'm going to add a little bit more Balor brown. I'm going to paint about half of the area we've just painted for each of those wing sections. This will start to make those wings stand out and see the detail and the leatheriness to them. Like so. And now we're going to use a little bit of Vallejo German Grey, and here we're just going to be adding some colour to the actual body and the kind of fingers of the wings, those ridges that run between them. Just want to be picking out some of those and adding the German Grey to them. I'm picking out the body, and they've got the little nose and the ears on each of the bats too. Now it's time for a little bit of Mechanicus Standard Grey. I'm going to use this just to highlight and pick out a few little details on them, so the feet, the snout, the ears, a few little sections of maybe ridges on the tops of the wings too, just to make them stand out. Like so. Now the final thing to work on is the armour. We're going to mix some Sunz of Horus green from Citadel with the black that we repainted the armour with, and all we're going to do with this mix is go down each of the ridges and the creases and folds in the armour and just add that dark green spooky kind of glow to the edge of it. Here I'm just working on the trim on the front of the hips. You've got a few nice little ridges there that you can work down. The armour is very, very angular, so there is plenty of opportunity to work on these ridges and practice in areas that maybe won't be seen as much as other areas. Once you've got those done, we're just going to use some pure Sunz of Horus green as the final coat, just to go over these edges and ridges and bring out the colour and make them just that little bit brighter. I'm leaving them on this as the final coat on the ridges. If you wanted to, you could probably use a little tiny bit of Citadel Nihilakh Oxide just to pick out some corners and angles if you wanted to, just to make them stand out a bit, but I'm quite happy with how it looks with just the Sunz of Horus green. And that is the finished Vampire Lord. I really like the miniature. I think the pose is awesome. I'm really happy with how it turned out too. Thanks for watching. I hope you've enjoyed the video, and if you have, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future content. Also, think about subscribing to some of our other social media, linked below. Thanks very much. If you like the channel and you enjoy the content and you'd like to support us, our Coffee and Patreon pages are linked below. Thanks very much.